You know, Mike Barnicle, it seems to me that Jeb Bush is owed an apology. Calling Donald Trump the chaos candidate in 2016, much like Mitt Romney said in 2012 that Russia was going to be America's greatest geopolitical threat. They were both mocked and ridiculed and ended up being right, both of them. But you just... for Americans who say, oh, expertise doesn't matter, we should talk to Tom Nichols about this and the death of expertise, or that we just want Donald Trump to shake things up. Look what happens when Donald Trump shakes things up. He doesn't have an interagency process at all. He doesn't have the Defense Department talking to the State Department, talking to his national security advisors, all the things that successful presidencies have. He just picks up a phone, calls, makes a decision on the spur of the moment. And that's why there is right now a global manufacturing recession, and why we're suffering through the worst manufacturing recession in over a decade, because the president just gets on the phone. He thinks that he has great and unmatched wisdom. And then he makes a step against China or against the EU or against others regarding tariffs or some other tax that discombobulates America's economy and our relations across the globe. There is no process. He is the chaos president. He is the chaos commander-in-chief. And we're all paying for it right now.
And you just referenced one of the key aspects of why we are in the middle of this chaos, Joe. Donald Trump today and always has resented the advice of others who are experts, because he regards himself as smarter than anyone. And what we're seeing play out here is the President of the United States, his ignorance of so many things. He has confused the endless war in Afghanistan and the endless war in the Middle East with America's role in the world. There are two separate items. He is ignorant of world history. He is ignorant of our own history. He is ignorant of the way our government operates and ought to operate. And thus we are where we are today, this morning, where we have people, Richard and I were talking about this off camera, we have people in the Pentagon who take an oath. They take a very serious oath when they enlist in the United States Army, the Marine Corps, or whatever. And part of that oath is to obey the orders of the President of the United States. But they know in the Pentagon, many of them, they are very smart people, and the American military represents the best that America has to offer, apart from war, everywhere in the world. The American military is there to help people, not hurt people, in so many countries around the world. Part of that oath is to obey the President of the United States of America. And now that's in doubt.
Well, and Tom, you've written about the president denigrating the service of some of the greatest military minds of our generation, people that have served honorably and served well. And here you had this guy who had his rich daddy find a VIP doctor, have bone spurs, have a diagnosis of bone spurs, so he could skip the Vietnam War and graduate from an Ivy League college. And the day he graduated from an Ivy League college, 40 Americans died in Vietnam that day. And yet this guy denigrates the greatest military minds of our generation on a daily basis, says he would have been a great general, and makes these decisions, which Lindsey Graham said, for God's sake, this will only strengthen ISIS. Mitch McConnell said this will only help ISIS. His closest allies have said this will only help ISIS. And he makes the decision without talking to one person who could have actually guided him in the safer direction, not only for America, but for Western civilization. It is, as you've written about, the death of expertise.
And, you know, Joe, when I wrote about the death of expertise, people asked me, what's causing this? You know, what's the root of this? And I said, we're suffering, and we've been suffering for decades now, from an epidemic of narcissism. And the president is Exhibit A, because this is the problem of the narcissistic unwillingness to believe that there is anybody that could possibly be smarter than you are. A good leader listens more than he talks. A good leader understands that when there are people in the room who have a lot of background, a lot of knowledge, a lot of expertise, that's a resource he can draw on. They're not there to just fight with him or argue with him. They're there to be a resource for him because they're trying to help him succeed. And he really bristles at that. He doesn't want to hear from experts because it triggers that insecurity in him that he just doesn't know enough or that his instincts aren't good enough. And that leads to disastrous decision-making because it leads to impulsive decision-making based on what you think you know, not what actually may be true or false. And we're seeing that every day where his rejection of expertise, North Korea, Iran, the Kurds, the trade war, I mean, all problems that experts warned him over and over again would cause problems. But he doesn't want to hear it.
Yeah, so Tom, let's make people uncomfortable right now, because this has been happening a lot recently. This has been happening, in fact, throughout the entire century with our commanders-in-chief. Chiefs, you can talk about Barack Obama. The constant complaint I heard from diplomats and Democratic senators and foreign policy experts who were rooting for the guy was Barack Obama always believed he was the smartest guy in the room. He didn't want to hear from generals. He didn't want to hear from, he always believed he was, I'm not saying that. I'm just telling you, and I know you heard it too, that he always believed that. And it led him to a foreign policy apparatus where it was the president and Ben Rhodes, and sometimes as chief of staff, sitting around making decisions. The interagency process did not function. George W. Bush goes into Iraq and never asks a man who ran the first war in Iraq, Colin Powell, whether he should go into or not. When asked why he didn't ask Colin Powell about whether he should invade Iraq the second time, George W. Bush's answer, well, I knew what he was going to say. We have been paying for the arrogance of commanders-in-chiefs in foreign policy now for 19 years, and it continues.
But I do think there's a difference between a president.
Yes, of course, there's a difference. Hold on a second. Thank you. I just want to make sure that all of our friends in Tweetland understand I am not putting them all together. I'm just simply saying there has been this attitude over the past 19 years from the past three presidents that they know better than the experts. And we have paid a price for it. But go ahead. You're right. There's a huge difference between Donald Trump and any of the 44 presidents who preceded him. He is so much more worse on such a larger scale. I'm just hoping the next president we have actually engages a little more in an interagency process that actually draws upon the wisdom of experts.
I was one of the people that was critical of President Obama in particular for what I thought was a certain amount of arrogance in decision-making. But there's a huge difference between having an interagency meeting, excuse me, having your advisors come in the room and then overruling them. There's a great moment that the New York Times reported at one point when Samantha Power was trying to make a point, and President Obama said something like, "Samantha, I get it. I've read your book." That he'd heard her, but he was rejecting her advice. That's very different than a president who has basically trashed the interagency process so that it doesn't even exist.
Yes, it is.
That the meetings don't happen. There is no consensus to overrule. People kind of creep into his office and say, what's it going to be today? And then they wait for a tweet to see if that's actually the policy that comes through. So there's no doubt that presidents carry that burden on their shoulders, and they tend to say, look, I'm the guy that, famous moments like Lyndon Johnson chewing out the Joint Chiefs, which also led to disaster. They carry a unique burden. In this case, the president is almost like decision-making is for him some kind of self-affirmation exercise rather than commanding and leading a superpower.
Again, just to be clear, this is recklessness.